A superpower does not collapse because of war, but because its allies walk away. And last week, Canada, America's closest friend for nearly a century, just declared something no one had ever dared to say. The dominance of the United States has ended. Not with a declaration of war, but with a speech in French, an $80 billion defense contract cut, and a comprehensive plan to detach entirely from dependence on Washington. This is not just a turning point for Canada. It is the beginning of a quiet unraveling of the global order led by the United States. The moment Canada said no. There were no gunshots, no coup, no emergency meeting at the Security Council, but in the heart of Toronto, in a not-so-noisy conference room, a spokesperson of the future, Mark Carney, dropped a diplomatic bomb that shook the Western order of the past 8 decades. Just 5 words, in French, La prédominance américaine est terminée. The dominance of the United States has ended. People once thought that if an ally ever turned its back on the U.S., it would be a disgruntled nation, a small country pushed to the sidelines of the global stage. But no, the one saying goodbye turned out to be the most loyal, quiet, and steadfast friend, Canada. A country that not only shares over 8,900 kilometers of border with the U.S., but also shares a defense system, democratic values, millions of cross-border families, and trillions of dollars in trade. But closeness is no longer enough, because loyalty has a limit, and Carney has declared that Canada has just reached it. No more ambiguity, no more silence. For the first time in modern history, a Canadian leader has publicly stated that the United States is no longer trustworthy. Not because Canada suddenly changed, but because Washington did. And changed too much, too fast, too dangerously. From tariff blows on steel and aluminum to reckless policy tweets, instability seems to have become a permanent state in the White House. And Canada, which had always patiently waited for the giant's anger to subside, has chosen to walk away rather than continue to be dragged down. What's more frightening than Carney's statement is the way he delivered it. Slowly, coldly, calculated. No personal emotion. No attacks. Only the determination of a nation that had been bound by blood to the U.S., now awakened. And that awakening didn't happen overnight, but came from years of being overlooked, treated as an afterthought, a strategic appendix, not worth satisfying. Asked to contribute, but not listened to. Hit with tariffs like a stranger, despite being the largest, most loyal partner. Eventually, that quiet dissatisfaction turned into a new vision. Canada must protect itself, both in security and economy, without waiting for Washington's blessing. And the first no came in the most sensitive area: defense. Instead of continuing to depend on American defense contractors like Lockheed Martin or Raytheon, Canada declared it would seek alternatives, not just to save money, but to regain control of its strategic fate. What was once thought impossible, a Canada that doesn't need American weapons, is now becoming national policy. This is not betrayal. It is a brutal reminder. Once trust is lost, it cannot be bought back with contracts. And if the U.S. treats its allies as mere consumers, not equal partners, then Canada, once and for all, will no longer play by the old rules. Carney didn't rally. He didn't shout. He simply did what Washington has long stopped doing with its allies: speak plainly, that the game has changed, that dominance is no longer assumed, and that leadership comes not from demanding, but from deserving. Carney's declaration is the first piece in a domino effect, but not a domino of war or division, a domino of awakening. Other allies are watching, and what they see is not a rebellious Canada, but a Canada that knows how to stand on its own. A superpower doesn't lose its standing overnight, but that standing begins to shake the moment its closest friend no longer believes, and dares to say so to the world. And that moment is today. when the money stopped flowing to Washington. No one said it aloud, but for decades, Washington understood one thing. Every time Canada signed a defense contract, the money flowed back to the U.S. Steady, stable, like a financial heartbeat that never missed a beat. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, America's defense industry giants, didn't need to compete. Canada was always there, a loyal, predictable customer who never bargained. But in 2025, that heartbeat stopped. Not because of a lack of budget, but because of a lack of trust. Canada's withdrawal from the F-35 program, a contract worth over $80 billion across nearly 4 decades, was not merely a procurement decision. It was a political statement disguised as a number. A statement that Canada would no longer fund instability. And in the world of American defense contractors, that wasn't bad news. It was a catastrophe. Imagine a factory in Texas, where F-35s are assembled like cars on a production line, suddenly receiving notice that its largest northern order had been cancelled. Not due to technical error, but because trust in the United States had fractured beyond repair. Engineers, mechanics, logistics workers, all of them not only lost a contract, they lost a future. Because the F-35 program isn't just a fighter jet, it's a symbol of America's economic and defense might, a product sold like a strategic identity. Each F-35 contract didn't just bring revenue, it reinforced Washington's position as the irreplaceable center of Western security. But when Canada pulled out, a gap began to open, not only on Lockheed Martin's balance sheet, but on America's global power map. Because Canada didn't pull out quietly. They pulled out with a plan. They pulled out with alternatives. And they're negotiating with Sweden, with France, with European partners, nations that were once in the trusted circle with the U.S., but are now growing skeptical. Canada alone can't scare America. But a Canada leading the path toward replacement. That's something the Pentagon has to stay up at night to calculate. Why is this so dangerous? Because the U.S. defense economic model deeply depends on international sales. Mega projects like the F-35 were designed not just for the U.S. military, but for allied forces, from Europe to Asia, on the assumption they would keep buying endlessly. Canada accounts for nearly 10% of global revenue for the F-35 program. Losing a partner like that isn't just losing revenue, it's losing scale. And when production scale shrinks, unit costs rise. When prices rise, other countries hesitate. When hesitation grows, sales drop further. And, like a spiral, the program may fall into a death cycle, where the very weight of its past success pulls it into the abyss. But the biggest loss isn't in numbers, it's in psychology. Because if a country like Canada, a model ally, can walk away, then who's next? Portugal quietly withdrew. Australia is partnering with the UK on submarines. Poland is looking to South Korea. Germany is signing with Israel. And while Washington remains obsessed with protecting traditional orders, the world has begun rewriting its strategic ledger. Carney didn't just cancel a contract, he canceled a belief that small countries can't survive without America. He proved the opposite, that it's America now living off the commitment of its allies, both economically and politically. And when that commitment is withdrawn, the U.S. doesn't just lose a customer, it loses a pillar in the ecosystem of power it spent nearly a century building. If collapse comes, it won't come from an attack. It will come from a canceled contract, a broken supply chain, an ally who stops buying. And when the factories shut down, when regions built on defense begin to shrink, people will realize a superpower cannot be strong if its allies no longer buy into the story it's selling. Canada just stopped buying. And that slammed door is still echoing through the quiet halls of the Pentagon. A shield built by their own hands. No one builds a fortress out of lost trust. And Canada, after years of waiting for stability to return from Washington, has quietly begun constructing its own fortress, not with concrete, but with industry, data, and strategy. When the F-35 contract was cancelled, many in the U.S. thought Canada was merely looking for another supplier. But the truth is, Canada isn't just looking for a new weapons vendor. They are becoming the producer themselves. This plan didn't emerge overnight. It was seeded by prolonged disappointment. Ever since tariffs were imposed on Canadian steel and aluminum, the very materials that once formed the backbone of defense production, Ottawa understood that as long as they remained dependent on the U.S. supply chain, they would always have a knife to their throat. So instead of just switching suppliers, they decided to change the rules of the game. In his shocking speech, Mark Carney didn't just announce the cancellation of the F-35 contract. He announced the creation of the Centralized Defense Procurement Agency, a new organization with a simple yet ambitious mission: to keep defense dollars inside Canada and to generate strategic self-reliance. This wasn't just a technical reform. This was an industrial revolution with a geopolitical undertone. With this agency, Canada, for the first time in modern history, is redefining the entire process from design, production, to deployment of defense equipment. From radar systems, precision weapons, unmanned aerial vehicles, to electronic warfare software, every domain is being restructured to prioritize domestic technology and talent. In a world where sovereignty no longer lies at the border, but in the ability to control technology, this is a shift of existential importance. And it starts with the smallest things. A defense tech center in Halifax, specializing in AI for cyber warfare. A new joint venture in British Columbia focused on dual-use civilian drones. A national fund worth billions of dollars to support domestic firms in accessing defense contracts that were once assumed to belong to American giants. Step by step, Canada is building a closed defense ecosystem, one that bears no names like Raytheon or Lockheed Martin, but instead names like Bombardier, CAE, McDonnell Detweiler, names that once stood in America's shadow, now called upon in national strategy as symbols of a strategically independent Canada. Why does this worry Washington so much? Because a self-reliant Canada isn't just the loss of a market, it's the loss of an anchor. In America's global strategy, allies aren't just burden-sharing partners. They are critical links that hold together America's supply chains, influence, and technological standards. When one ally disconnects from that chain and starts building their own, it means more than withdrawal. It's technological secession. And that's secession, coming from a country with high technological capability, stable democracy, and crucial geopolitical position like Canada, is all the more dangerous. Because it sets a precedent. It presents a working alternative model to other nations growing skeptical of Washington. That you can build modern defense capabilities without signing over your future to an increasingly erratic superpower. Canada isn't saying they are against the U.S. They are simply doing one thing: protecting themselves in their own way. And in an era where trust between nations is more fragile than ever, that action is no longer a choice. It is a necessity. Like a child in the family deciding to move out, Canada didn't slam the door, but they've started building their own home, with their own steel, their own intelligence, and with the ambition to never be dependent again. And that, for the United States, is the most concerning thing of all: the price of a tweet. Every major collapse in history begins with a moment that seems trivial. A careless word, a rushed decision, a rejected handshake. But for the United States in 2025, the turning point didn't come from a public action. It came from a tweet. A tweet announcing tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and agricultural products. under the pretense of national security. Never has a phrase been so distorted in meaning. Canada was never a threat to the U.S. They are the backbone of the North American supply chain, the most stable source of electricity, oil, minerals, food, and gas Washington has ever had. But in that moment, America forgot the relationship, and Canada remembered the insult. Ottawa's response at the time seemed mild. A few press conferences, some deeply disappointed statements, a handful of symbolic retaliatory measures. But the truth lay behind closed doors, where the Prime Minister's advisors and strategic planners began asking an unprecedented question: can we still trust the United States? And when that question echoed, everything began to change. The frightening thing wasn't that Canada was angry. It was that Canada quietly started planning. Not loudly. Not loudly like the Twitter spats. Not tensely like U.S. congressional hearings, but silently, coldly, and with precision. Secret meetings with European suppliers. Hundreds of pages of reports on dependency on American goods. Budget reallocations from imports to domestic investment. Canada didn't pull a gun. They pulled the plug. The U.S. had long viewed Ottawa as an extension of itself, a safe partner, easy to manage, sharing values, and never causing major friction. But when treated like an enemy, even if only through a social media post, Canada was forced to reflect. And they came to a painful realization. This relationship only endures if both sides still respect each other. Trump's tariff policy wasn't just an economic mistake. It was a blow to the moral foundation of the alliance. And what made it dangerous was the arrogance in how it was executed. No warning, no negotiation, no regard for consequences. In the eyes of Americans, it might have been a strategic move. But in the eyes of Canadians, it was betrayal. Because if an enemy imposes tariffs, it's expected. But when the very brother who defended borders with you in the world wars, co-founded NORAD to monitor North American airspace, co-signed NAFTA, suddenly targets your core industries for domestic political bargaining, then that is no longer commerce. That is a strategic insult. No one likes being used as a campaign talking point, and no one wants to be traded for applause in a rally in Ohio. But that is exactly what happened. Canada, with its green industry, stable energy chain, and open market, suddenly became a target in a game without rules. And they learned a lesson. No one is safe if their future depends on an increasingly unpredictable nation. It was in that silence that Canada began the process of policy divorce. No confrontation, no dramatic statements, just a gradual shift. Contracts, supply chains, and trust moved one by one. What's the price of a tweet? For America, it might be the loss of a market. But for the world, it's the loss of faith in a superpower's leadership. And once that faith has cracked, no tweet can ever mend it again. The domino effect has begun. Canada didn't need to speak up to set an example. They just needed to act, and the world instantly understood the message. If a country like Canada can rise up and step out from America's shadow, then no one is incapable of doing the same. And that effect is spreading faster than anything the Pentagon predicted. In European security summits, in East Asian defense meetings, in Nordic logistics memos, the name Canada is no longer just a friendly ally, but a symbol of strategic awakening. An ally that once endured in silence has now become a mirror for other nations to look into and ask themselves, if they could do it, why can't we? Australia was one of the first to shift. Not loud like China, not hesitant like Germany, Canberra signed a nuclear submarine agreement with the UK, removing America from the design and deployment chain. Not because they hate the US, but because they fear America's unpredictability. When a country like Australia, a pillar of the Five Eyes intelligence alliance, starts diversifying its strategic partnerships, it's clear something is cracking deep within the foundation of the Western order. In Europe, the winds of change blow even stronger. Germany, cautious and pragmatic, turned to Israel for missile defense systems instead of expanding cooperation with the U.S. Poland, a country long proud of being Washington's closest ally in Eastern Europe, is now negotiating to import military equipment from South Korea. And France and Italy, key EU members, have quietly pushed forward a plan to build a European defense bloc, independent of NATO. No one says it out loud, but everyone is moving, silently. And as those movements intersect, something strange begins to happen. Smaller countries, once bound by dependence on the U.S. supply chain, begin building networks with each other. Canada negotiates fighter jets with Sweden. Sweden shares radar tech with Finland. Finland imports electronic weapons from Germany. Germany sets up semiconductor supply chains with Japan. And the U.S. is increasingly left out. This is no longer an isolated withdrawal. This is a restructuring. The world, once accustomed to leaning on Washington as its anchor, is now seeking new pillars. There is no single superpower taking America's place. Instead, there's a complex, decentralized network of alliances where leadership is divided and diffused, and that, for the United States, is more dangerous than any traditional enemy. Because when allies no longer trust you, no longer need you to maintain stability, then you, no matter how powerful your military, cannot shape the future. And that truth is now clearer than ever. Canada didn't walk away alone. They walked away first. And the vacuum they left in America's global strategy is quietly being filled by other nations, not with loyalty, but with new calculations. If the U.S. was once the center of an order based on consensus, it is now that very loss of consensus that's making that center obsolete. And the world, which once revolved around the United States, is beginning to redraw its own orbital map. The only problem is, Washington still doesn't seem to realize it's standing on the sidelines of the very game it created. The price of complacency. There is an illusion that every superpower has once believed, that power is automatic, that influence is a fixed asset, and that allies, once within the orbit, will never leave. America of the 2020s is living in that illusion. But what Washington doesn't realize, or chooses to ignore, is that reality has shifted. Power no longer comes from demand, but from the ability to maintain trust. For nearly a century, the U.S. built an alliance system considered the greatest in modern history. But one thing the Pentagon or the State Department rarely admits is that system only exists because of the belief that America has always been the most reliable place to lean on. When the world faces crisis, nations look to Washington. When they need a strategic frame of reference, they choose the American model. But what happens when the U.S. itself becomes the most unstable factor in the equation? Canada is not an exception. They're just the first to say out loud what many other nations have whispered behind closed doors: that America has become too erratic, too imposing, too unpredictable, and, above all, too selfish. From sudden policy tweets to unilateral sanctions, from withdrawing from international agreements to ignoring partners' interests, the U.S. no longer acts like a guide, but like someone holding the map who refuses to let others see it. In that model, complacency is no longer a weakness. It becomes the operational core. And the price to pay is now revealing itself day by day. When Canada decided to stop purchasing the F-35, America lost more than $70 billion over 40 years. But that's just the surface. What Washington refuses to face is the domino effect of a collapsing ecosystem. Lockheed Martin doesn't just lose sales, they lose optimal production scale. When scale shrinks, costs rise. When costs rise, other countries hesitate. When hesitation becomes delay, the supply chain breaks. And there's nothing easier to lose than competitiveness in the global arms market, where every decision is a strategic declaration. Inside the U.S., that means job loss, factory closures, and loss of faith in communities that once thrived on international defense contracts. From Texas, where the F-35 is assembled, to Connecticut, where engines are made, from Missouri to Georgia, places where each ally departure leaves behind an economic void that no diplomatic statement can patch. And the most dangerous part? It's that the people in those states who once saw foreign policy as something distant will be the first to feel the consequences. They don't need to read national security reports to know something is wrong. They just need to see the factory shorten shifts. Their kids struggle to get internships. The stores around military bases start closing earlier than usual. And when they begin to ask questions, the answers won't come from foreign enemies, but from domestic failures. Meanwhile, the world isn't standing still. Europe no longer sees the U.S. as its sole protector. Asia no longer depends on Washington to keep regional balance. And even in Latin America, once tightly bound to U.S. influence through economics and politics, new options are emerging. China, the EU, even India. America's isolation isn't coming from hostility. It's coming from the exhaustion of trust. And when a superpower loses that intangible asset, every aircraft carrier, every missile, every America First slogan becomes a hollow echo in a hall that's growing emptier by the day. Not because they hate America, but because they no longer see a reason to stay. Canada was just the first to stand up. The rest of the room is quietly wondering, is it time we left too? From a silent eulogy. If an alliance could survive on history alone, then the Roman Empire would still stand, and the Soviet Union would never have collapsed. But history doesn't guarantee the future. It merely serves as a reminder that every power, no matter how glorious, has an end. And the moment Canada stood up, not to criticize, but to separate itself from the system built by the United States, was no longer a mere policy act. It was a eulogy, even without funeral music, or a flag lowered to half-mast. This eulogy carries no tone of tragedy. It carries the color of exhaustion. Exhausted from unreciprocated commitments. Exhausted from being treated as a default part of a plan they had no power to amend. Exhausted from constantly being treated as a second-tier partner, even after playing a first-tier role in every crisis. There has not been a crisis in the past 80 years where Canada stood aside. From Berlin to Kabul, from Kosovo to Ukraine, from counterterrorism to disaster relief, Canada has always been there, sharing risks, deploying troops, offering logistical support. Not a single request from Washington went unconsidered by Ottawa in good faith. And precisely because of that, when Canada chose to step back, not with a slammed door, but with a calculated strategic move, the world knew this was not a rash reaction, but a bitter conclusion. Carney didn't just say, "American predominance is over." He voiced what many other leaders still hesitate to admit. Leadership cannot be demanded, it must be earned. And America, caught in its own vortex, has forgotten that. While other democracies are adapting to a new era, where competition is no longer just about weapons and resources, but about data, trust, and stability, the U.S. remains stuck in an old power game, pressuring, imposing standards, and assuming allies will continue to stand by simply because they have no other choice. But now they do. Canada, by cutting the flow of defense dollars to Washington, didn't just hurt an industry. They opened a way out. A demonstration that it is possible to step out of America's orbit and still live, still thrive, even thrive more, when free to steer strategy based on national interest rather than alliance-driven compromises. And in a world being reshaped, that example shines brighter than any slogan. America once believed there were only two states of existence, within U.S. influence or against it. But what Canada has chosen is a new state, no longer revolving around America, not confronting, not submitting, but self-defining, in a world that no longer takes Washington as its central reference. And it is that very choice that makes Canada's move the most dangerous. It doesn't provoke war, but it provokes doubt. Doubt over whether the U.S.-led order is truly the best choice. Doubt over whether new alliances, decentralized, genuinely cooperative, no longer anchored to a single center of power, are possible. Doubt over whether the U.S. is still worthy of a national future being tied to it, at a time when its own stability grows more fragile than ever. And when that doubt spreads, it doesn't need tanks or bombers to reshape the world. It only needs one thing: the silent consent of former loyal allies. Silent, but no longer standing together. Silent, but already stepping out the door. Silent, like the beginning of a funeral, not with crying, but with an undeniable emptiness. And America, if it does not awaken, may be the last one left in the room, among an alliance that has quietly come undone.